They say some storms don't come with thunder. Some arrive barefoot, bleeding, and barely breathing. And when you open the door, they change everything. Jonas McRae had buried more than his wife under that cottonwood tree. He'd buried his voice, his past, and any fool notion of hope. But that winter, when the snow pressed like silence over the prairie, something knocked at his world. It didn't come in fists. It came in the form of a girl. Comanche blood, scarred arm, eyes that had seen too much. She didn't beg, she didn't speak, but she stayed. And that's when the storm began, not outside, but inside. This ain't a story about rescue. It's about choosing. It's about two people too broken to be saved, learning they could still hold something sacred in their hands. If they didn't flinch, what would you have done? If the past showed up at your porch wearing wolfskin and war paint, would you raise your rifle or open the door? Tell me your thoughts down in the comments. Do you think Jonas made the right call? And if you were Nahili, would you have stayed or Chem? The wind, a mournful caller, swept across the vast, unforgiving plains, piling snow against Jonas's small, weathered cabin. Winter in this part of the West had a way of stripping things down to their essentials: life, warmth, and the stark, aching silence of memory. 3 years, 3 long, snow-choked winters since Martha had been laid to rest. And still, the quiet in their home was a sound louder than any storm. It was a quiet steeped in her absence, a void her laughter once filled, now occupied by the ghosts of happier days and a sorrow that had become his most constant companion. He lived a life pared down, like the landscape outside his window. Each day, a pattern of small routines, a bulwark against the encroaching loneliness. The cabin itself felt suspended, a moment held captive. Martha's touch was everywhere, most keenly in the intricate embroideries she'd painstakingly stitched onto every spare piece of linen and muslin. Tiny bluebirds on the dish towels, a sprawling vine of prairie roses across the quilt on the bed they'd shared, wildflowers on the curtains that framed the frost-etched windows, each stitch a testament to her patience, her love of color in a world that often offered only shades of brown and gray. Jonas would run a calloused finger over the raised threads, feeling the echo of her hand, the whisper of her presence. It was as if her needle had not just woven patterns, but had somehow stilled time within those 4 walls, preserving their life together in a delicate, heartbreaking tapestry. The air itself seemed to carry the faint, lingering scent of the lavender she used to tuck into their linens, a scent that could, on certain evenings, bring tears to his eyes without warning. This particular night, the wind howled with a peculiar insistence, a hungry sound that scraped at the eaves and rattled the window panes. Jonas sat by the hearth, the fire casting flickering shadows that danced like specters on the log walls. He'd been trying to read, the familiar weight of his worn Bible in his lap, but the words blurred, his thoughts drifting, as they often did, to Martha. He found himself listening, not to the wind, but for something else, something lost. Then, a different sound, or so he thought, faint, almost swallowed by the gale, a whimper, a cry. He straightened, his head tilted. Probably just the wind playing tricks, he told himself, settling back. But there it was again, a thin thread of sound, nearly unraveled by the storm, yet undeniably human. For a fleeting, irrational moment, his heart lurched. Martha, the name formed in his mind, a whisper of desperate hope, quickly dismissed as foolishness. Yet, the sound, distant as it was, tugged at something primal within him, an instinct to investigate, to protect. He rose, the old floorboards groaning under his weight, pulled on his heavy coat and sheepskin-lined boots, his movements deliberate, methodical. The cold outside was a physical blow, stealing his breath, the driven snow stinging his face. He shielded his eyes, peering into the swirling white chaos. The old cottonwood by the creek, its bare branches skeletal against the bruised twilight sky, seemed to be the source. And there, at its base, a dark shape huddled against the pale drift, almost swallowed by the snow. As he drew closer, his lantern cutting a shaky circle in the gloom, the shape resolved itself into a human form. A girl, young, her face turned away, a cascade of dark hair stark against the snow. A crimson stain, shockingly bright, blossomed on the white canvas beneath her, spreading from her shoulder down towards her wrist. A macabre flower unfurling in the frost. For a moment, Jonas froze, the sight locking the air in his lungs. The blood, where it had initially spattered in tiny droplets on a pristine patch of fresh snow, formed a delicate, crystalline pattern, almost like a six-petaled snowflake, intricate and terrible. A whisper, so faint he might have imagined it, seemed to brush past his ear, like the rustle of Martha's skirts, or her voice calling his name on a summer evening. Destiny, a word he rarely pondered, felt suddenly heavy in the frigid air. He knelt, his old knees protesting, and gently turned her. Her face, pale as moonlight, was framed by that dark, damp hair. She was young, barely a woman. Her breathing was shallow, ragged. He saw the torn fabric of her dress, the deeper, seeping wound beneath. There was no question of who she was or why she was here. Not then. There was only the immediate, urgent need. With a grunt, Jonas gathered her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile weight against his chest. He carried her back towards the distant, welcoming glow of his cabin, each step a struggle against the wind and the deepening drifts. The silence between them was absolute, broken only by his labored breaths and her occasional, almost inaudible moan. He didn't press her, didn't ask the questions that were already forming like ice crystals in his mind. Who was she? What had happened? Who had done this to her? For now, survival was the only answer that mattered. Inside, the warmth of the cabin wrapped around them. He laid her gently on the rag rug before the hearth, the firelight playing over her still features. Her skin was cold to the touch, her lips tinged with blue. He worked quickly, his hands, though rough from years of ranch work, surprisingly deft. He cut away the torn, blood-soaked fabric, his gaze clinical, yet gentle. The wound was ugly, a deep gash that ran from her shoulder towards her elbow. He cleaned it as best he could with warm water and lye soap, then bound it tightly with strips of clean linen. Linen Martha had embroidered with forget-me-nots. As he tended to her, she stirred, her eyelids fluttering. Her eyes, when they opened, were dark and wide, filled with a fleeting terror that slowly gave way to a wary confusion. She tried to speak, a hoarse whisper, the words broken, unfamiliar, some English, heavily accented, mangled. Then, a softer string of syllables, words that flowed like water over stones, words he recognized from fleeting encounters long ago. Comanche. She survived the night. Jonas sat vigil in his armchair, the rifle propped beside him, his gaze drifting between the girl's still form and the restless dance of the flames. He'd given her his bed, the one Martha had graced, a decision that felt both right and strangely unsettling. He watched the slow rise and fall of her chest, the faint color returning to her cheeks. He wondered about the path that had led her to his door, a path paved with violence and desperation. He thought of Martha then, of her inherent kindness, her belief in the good of people, even when the world showed its harshest face. He found himself wrestling with a familiar, unsettling question, one that had haunted him in the lonely years. Could kindness, in a world as brutal as this, be a form of weakness, or was it, perhaps, the only true way a man had left to try and mend the broken pieces of his own soul? a quiet act of atonement for perceived failings, for losses he couldn't prevent. When dawn finally broke, painting the snow-covered plains in hues of pale rose and gold, Nahili, for that was the name she eventually whispered, her voice still fragile, was awake. She sat propped against the pillows, her dark eyes following his every move. There was no fear in them now, not exactly, but a deep, ingrained caution, the watchfulness of a hunted animal. She didn't speak much, and Jonas didn't press her. He cooked a thin broth, spooning it to her lips when she proved too weak to hold the spoon herself. He moved about his chores, the silence in the cabin different now. It was no longer entirely empty. It held a new tension, a new presence, fragile yet undeniable. Nahili, she said little of her past, offered no explanation for her wounds or her flight, but her eyes, ancient and knowing despite her youth, spoke of a story she wasn't ready to tell. Jonas didn't push. He understood the need for refuge, the solace of unspoken sanctuary. He sensed she was running from something, or someone, a future perhaps already laid out for her, one she refused to accept. He, a man anchored too firmly to his past, felt an odd, unspoken connection to this girl fleeing a fate she hadn't chosen. He saw the contrast starkly, his own life, buried under the weight of memory, the cabin a shrine to a time that was no more. Each embroidered flower a beautiful, painful reminder of what was lost. And then there was Nahili, a whirlwind of untold stories and unknown dangers, a life violently interrupted, yet fiercely clinging to the hope of a future, yet unwritten. He couldn't shake the feeling that by opening his door to the stranger in the snow, he had unknowingly stepped out of the frozen stillness of his grief and into a current far stronger, far more unpredictable than he could have ever imagined. The quiet plains, once a refugee for his sorrow, now held the echo of an approaching storm, and perhaps, just perhaps, the faintest promise of a thaw. The days that followed settled into a rhythm, as new and fragile as the first green shoots of spring pushing through a late snow. Nahili healed, the angry gash on her arm, which Jonas had initially cleaned with a grim, detached efficiency born of battlefield necessity and a lifetime of ingrained caution towards her kind, slowly began to knit. He was a man of his time, and the word Comanche conjured a lifetime of tales whispered around campfires, of conflict and a deep, abiding mistrust. His first instinct, seeing her lying there in the snow, bleeding and broken, had been the primal urge to help a suffering creature. But once she was within the firelight of his cabin, her dark hair fanned out on Martha's pillow, her heritage clear in her features, and the few halting Comanche words she'd uttered, a colder, more wary part of him had surfaced. He'd kept his rifle closer those first few nights, his sleep lighter, his ears tuned for any sound that wasn't the wind or the crackle of the fire. Yet, Nahili did little to stoke his suspicions. She was a ghost in the cabin at first, her movements silent, her presence almost ethereal. As strength returned to her, Jonas watched, his gaze often narrowed, trying to reconcile the stories with the girl before him. She was not the fierce, wild caricature he might have half expected. Instead, he saw a quiet sorrow in her dark eyes, a weariness that spoke of trials no young woman should endure. He'd seen that look before, in the eyes of young soldiers who'd witnessed too much, too soon. It was a look that transcended tribe or tongue. She moved with an innate grace, her actions economical and purposeful. She'd rise early, her bare feet light on the wooden floorboards, and rekindle the fire before Jonas had even thought to stir from his makeshift bed on the sheepskin rug. He'd watch her through slitted eyes, a part of him still expecting. He didn't quite know what, but she'd simply tend the flames, her profile serene in the growing light. She observed his chores with those dark, watchful eyes, and soon began to anticipate them, mending a tear in his worn coat. With thread she'd carefully unraveled from a scrap, her stitches small and even. It wasn't Martha's intricate embroidery, born of leisure and love, but the practical, neat work of a woman accustomed to making do. He found himself comparing, then chiding himself for it. This girl was not Martha, nor did she pretend to be. She had a way with the small flock of chickens he kept, her voice a low, gentle murmur as she scattered their feed, a sound that seemed to calm their usual frantic clucking. Jonas, who'd always found the birds flighty and loud, saw them gather around her almost trustingly. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, as the shadows lengthened and the fire crackled its hypnotic song, she would hum, then sing softly, melodies in her native tongue. At first, the unfamiliar cadence had unsettled him, making the small cabin feel even more alien. But as the days turned into a week, then, too, the sound began to lose its foreign edge. The songs were mournful, yes, but also strangely comforting, like the whisper of wind through distant pines. Lullabies, he reckoned, that spoke of vast skies and whispering grasses, songs her mother must have sung to her. In those moments, the cabin felt less like a tomb of memories and more like a shelter, a place where two solitary souls, from vastly different worlds, had found a temporary, uneasy harbor. His ingrained wariness began to fray, replaced by a reluctant curiosity. Jonas, in turn, found himself slowly unearthing parts of his own story, words he hadn't spoken aloud in years, prompted not by any question from her, but by the quiet companionship that had begun to grow between them. One evening, Nahili was carefully examining one of Martha's embroidered tea towels, a pattern of tiny, intricate hummingbirds, her slender fingers tracing the delicate stitches. The sight stirred something in him, a memory of Martha's own quiet industry. "My wife, Martha, she made those," he said, his voice a little rusty from disuse, "had a gentle hand with a needle." Nahili looked up, her dark eyes unreadable, but she listened. "I was a medic once," he continued, the words coming easier now. "In the war, Army of the Potomac. Saw too much of what men can do to each other." He paused, the firelight etching deep lines around his eyes. "Lost a child, too, a boy." Barely had a chance to draw breath. The admission hung in the air, raw and heavy. He'd never told anyone here about their son. Martha and he had carried that grief westward, hoping the vastness of the land might somehow absorb it. Martha, she always dreamed of a place with room to breathe, away from the confines of the East. After she was gone, I just kept heading west, looking for some kind of peace, I suppose. Nahili listened, her hands still on the embroidered cloth, her gaze fixed on him. She offered no platitudes, no easy comfort, just a profound, unwavering attention that felt more understanding than any words could have been. In her stillness, he felt not judgment or alien distance, but a shared recognition of loss. It was a communion forged in unspoken sorrow. His buried grief, her hidden trauma. He realized then, with a start, that the deep well of sadness in her eyes was not so different from the ache in his own heart. He began to notice other things about her, small details that hinted at a life far more complex and dangerous than he could fathom, details that pushed past his remaining prejudices. A thin, silvery scar, old and faded, curled just below her left ear, disappearing into her hairline. It wasn't from the recent attack. This was a scar with history, a deliberate mark. He saw it one afternoon as she was braiding her long, dark hair, her head tilted towards the window, the pale winter light catching the faint line. His first, conditioned thought was of tribal savagery, of brutal customs, but looking at her calm, focused expression as she wove her hair, the thought soured. That scar wasn't a mark of her culture. It was a mark of cruelty, an attempt to silence her, to control her. He said nothing, but the sight settled a cold stone of protective anger in his gut, an anger that surprised him with its intensity. One day, while she was outside checking a snare line he'd set, she had a knack for spotting the subtle signs of game, a skill that far surpassed his own. Jonas, tidying the small space she'd claimed as her own, came across a small, worn leather pouch tucked beneath her meager roll of bedding. He hesitated, a sense of trespass warring with a deeper concern. The old Jonas, the suspicious one, might have seen it as his right to know what an Indian woman concealed in his home. But the man he was becoming felt only a reluctant need to understand. To protect, he opened it. Inside lay 3 objects. The first was a small piece of buckskin, not unlike the material of her dress, but softer, finer. Embroidered on it, in threads of dyed porcupine quill, was a single, stylized bluebird, its wings outstretched in flight, a motif strikingly similar to the birds Martha had favored, yet distinctly of Nahili's own people, a poignant echo, a bridge between 2 lost worlds. It spoke not of a faceless tribe, but of a mother, a tradition, a personal emblem. The second was a ring, crudely fashioned from beaten silver, snapped in 2, the break jagged and sharp, a promise broken, a bond forcibly severed. He could almost imagine a young, determined hand breaking it, a symbol of defiance against a fate she refused. Perhaps this was tied to the man she might have been promised to, a young, ambitious brave from her tribe, one who wouldn't take kindly to being spurned. It spoke of a struggle for her own will, her own future. The last item sent a shiver down his spine, a fragment of a letter, written on brittle paper in a spidery, unfamiliar hand. Much of it was charred, the edges blackened and crumbling, but a few words in English were discernible. No escape. He will find you. Duty demands. The rest was lost to the flames, but the message was clear, a venomous whisper from the past. She was so desperately trying to outrun. These were not the artifacts of an enemy. They were the relics of a hunted soul. Nahili lived with him not as a guest seeking permission, but as one reclaiming a stolen piece of her own life, her own autonomy. She asked for little, but contributed much, her presence weaving itself into the fabric of his solitary existence. There was a quiet dignity about her, a resilience that belied her youth and the horrors she had evidently endured. It was as if every small act, every chore completed, every silent observation of the world around her, was a step towards rebuilding a self that had been fractured but not broken. Jonas found himself letting go of the harsh labels, the ingrained fears. He began to see not the Comanche girl, but Nahili, the fragile piece of their shared solitude. However, was not destined to last. Jonas had started noticing things a few days prior, signs that made the hairs on the back of his neck prickle, a patch of disturbed snow near the creek, where no animal he knew would have left such a print, a freshly broken branch on the game trail leading to the spring, snapped at a height that suggested human passage. Then, this morning, an arrow. It was lodged deep in the top rail of his corral fence, its fletching distinct. Comanche, but with a subtle difference in the binding that made him uneasy. It wasn't a stray shot from a hunt. It was a marker, a message. Someone was out there, watching, tracking. His gut tightened. They knew she was here. His concern was no longer for himself, or the disruption to his solitude. It was for her. The tension in the cabin had become a palpable thing, an unspoken current running beneath their quiet routines. Nahili, too, seemed to sense it, her already keen awareness sharpening. Her gaze would often drift to the horizon, a flicker of something unreadable in her dark eyes. Not fear, but a weary readiness. Then came the morning when the world outside was hushed beneath a fresh, deep blanket of snow. The rising sun cast long, blue shadows, the air crystalline and cold. As Jonas stepped out to fetch wood, he saw them, a ring of horseshoe prints, stark against the untrodden white, circling the cabin at a respectful distance. His heart hammered against his ribs. He scanned the low ridge that overlooked his small homestead, and there they were, a line of riders, perhaps a dozen, sitting motionless on their ponies, silhouetted against the pale morning sky. Comanche, their breath plumed in the frigid air. They were too far to see their faces clearly, but their intent was unmistakable. One rider, taller than the others, sat slightly ahead, a figure of authority. Nahili appeared at his side, her breath catching in a small, sharp gasp. She clutched the doorframe, her knuckles white. Jonas saw the recognition dawn in her eyes, followed not by terror, but by a profound, sorrowful resignation. "They have come," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sudden thumping of his own heart. He saw her shoulders straighten, a flicker of the same defiance he'd sensed in the broken ring. "It is my father," she said, her gaze fixed on the lead rider. The chief. She didn't try to run, didn't try to hide. There was nowhere to go, and Jonas, though a cold knot of apprehension tightened in his stomach, a residual echo of old fears, found himself standing firm, a half step in front of her. He wouldn't step back. The transformation within him, gradual and quiet as the changing seasons, had taken root. He didn't know what was coming, what words would be spoken, what demands would be made. But in that frozen moment, under the cold, watchful eyes of the riders on the ridge, one thing was clear. He was no longer just a man haunted by his past, wary of the world. He was a man standing beside a brave young woman who refused to be erased, a woman who had, against all odds and his own stubborn heart, found a place beside him. The snow-covered plain, once a symbol of his isolation, had become a stage for a confrontation he had not sought, but would not now avoid. His hand instinctively went to the worn wooden stock of the rifle leaning just inside the door, not in aggression, but in readiness to protect what little sanctuary they had built. The riders on the ridge descended with the slow, inevitable grace of a winter hawk, their ponies picking their way through the snow with sureness. Jonas stood his ground, Nahili a silent, straight-backed figure just beside and slightly behind him. He could feel the tremors running through her, not of fear, he thought, but of a profound, sorrowful anticipation. The man in the lead, taller and broader than the others, dismounted with a fluid movement that belied his age. His face, when he drew closer, was a map of seasons and sorrows, stern but etched with a deep, familiar pain that resonated with Jonas's own. This was Navo, the chief, Nahili's father. His eyes, dark and piercing, swept over Jonas with cold assessment, lingered on the humble cabin as if it were a cage, then settled on his daughter with an intensity that was both commanding and heartbreaking. Behind Navo, a younger warrior caught Jonas's attention, practically vibrating with a dark energy, lean and hard, with eyes like chips of obsidian that glittered with malice. He radiated a coiled, resentful impatience. His hand, Jonas noted, never strayed far from the bone handle of the knife sheathed at his hip, clenching and unclenching as if eager for release. This was Turok, the one for whom, perhaps, the broken ring in Nahili's pouch had been intended. His gaze devoured Nahili, a possessive fire smoldering within its depths, and when it flicked to Jonas, it was with an undisguised, venomous contempt that promised violence. Nahili, Navo's voice was deep, resonant, carrying easily in the still, cold air. It was not a shout, but a statement, an invocation heavy with a father's authority and sorrow. "You will return to your people, The bond of blood cannot be denied, nor broken by a whim of the heart. He spoke in English, for Jonas's benefit, Jonas presumed, though his gaze remained locked on his daughter. Turok shifted, a low growl rumbling in his chest, almost an animalistic sound of displeasure, but a sharp, almost imperceptible glance from Navo stilled him. Nahili stepped forward then, moving from behind Jonas's protective stance to face her father squarely. Her voice, when she answered, was low but clear, devoid of tremor, imbued with a calm resolve that seemed to echo the vast, silent strength of the plains themselves. "Father," she acknowledged him with a slight inclination of her head. "If that bond, the one of blood, is woven only with threads of silence and coercion, if it demands I smother the voice within me, then perhaps it is a bond that must be allowed to die, so that I may live." Turok visibly bristled at her words, taking a half-step forward, his hand flying to his knife. "She dishonors you. She dishonors us all," he snarled in his own tongue, his face contorted with fury. Navo's response was swift. Not a word, but a look so potent, so filled with cold command, that Turok froze, his hand falling away from his weapon, though his eyes continued to burn with insubordination and hatred for the white man he clearly blamed. The air crackled with unspoken words, with the weight of tradition pressing against the unyielding spirit of individual will. It wasn't a quarrel, not in the way of raised voices and angry gestures. It was a far more profound contest, a delicate, dangerous balancing act between two worlds, two philosophies. Navo, the embodiment of ancestral ties, of the tribe as a sacred whole. Nahili, a lone hawk seeking the freedom of her own sky, the right to choose her own path. However perilous, Navo's gaze shifted. Then, from his daughter to Jonas, the scrutiny was intense, assessing the white man, he said, the words flat, devoid of inflection. He gives you shelter. Does he understand what it means to protect one who carries the spirit of our people? He paused, then issued his challenge, not to Jonas directly, but as a pronouncement. A man's worth is shown in how he provides, how he respects the life he takes to sustain life. I will hunt. He will come. It was a test. Jonas knew, a ritual as old as the hills, a way to measure his character, his skill, his heart. Far from the charged atmosphere of the cabin, he met Navo's gaze. "I will come," he said, his voice steady. He saw a flicker of something in Nahili's eyes. Respect, perhaps, or a renewed anxiety for him. Turok, standing just behind Navo, let out a derisive snort, his lips curling in a sneer, as Jonas made ready, strapping on his own hunting knife and checking his rifle. Navo spoke briefly to his warriors in their own tongue. Most remained by the cabin, a silent, watchful perimeter. Turok, however, with a curt nod from Navo, moved to retrieve his own pony. It seemed he would accompany them, or at least follow, a predator shadowing the proceedings. The moment Navo and Jonas prepared to ride out, their attention briefly on their mounts, Turok saw his opening. He moved with a viper's speed. Closing the distance to Nahili, he grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons. "This changes nothing. Little bird," he hissed, his face inches from hers, his breath hot with menace. "You play at freedom in this white man's pathetic cage. You belong to the people. You belong to me. You shamed me. You shamed our traditions. That debt will be paid. When this farce is over, I will drag you back myself if I must, and then you will learn the true meaning of belonging." Nahili wrenched her arm free, her eyes blazing with a fire that matched his own, though she uttered no sound. Jonas, turning at the slight commotion, saw the red marks on her arm and the raw hatred in Turok's face. A cold fury, protective and primal, surged through him, but Navo was already mounting, his expression unreadable. This was not the time. The hunt was a silent, tense affair. Navo rode with an easy familiarity, his eyes constantly scanning, reading the subtle language of the snow-covered land. Jonas, a competent hunter himself, found a grudging respect growing for the older man's profound connection to the wilderness. Turok, however, trailed them like a jackal, his presence a constant, irritating prickle on Jonas's senses. Twice, Jonas was sure he saw Turok make a subtle movement, a flick of the wrist, perhaps to send a stone skittering, just as they were closing in on potential game, forcing the animals to bolt. The young warrior's attempts at sabotage were subtle enough to be deniable, but the intent was clear, to make Jonas fail. At one point, Navo rode ahead to scout a narrow ravine. For a few taut minutes, Jonas and Turok were alone, hidden from the chief's view by a rise. Turok edged his pony closer, until their knees almost brushed. He didn't speak, but slowly drew his knife, testing its edge with his thumb. His obsidian eyes locked on Jonas in a silent, chilling promise of violence. Jonas met his gaze, his own hand resting near the rifle in his saddle scabbard, his expression unyielding. The air thrummed with unspoken threats. After another hour of tracking, Navo signaled. A buck, a fine one, stood partially concealed in a copse of frosted aspens. Navo gestured with his chin towards Jonas. The test. Jonas dismounted, his movement slow, deliberate, acutely aware of Turok positioned slightly to his flank, a potential disruption. As he raised his rifle, the sun glinted off the barrel. For a heart-stopping moment, the world wavered. He saw not the deer, but Martha's face, her smile gentle, her eyes filled with that quiet understanding he missed so desperately. Her hand, ephemeral, seemed to rest on his shoulder. It's all right, Jonas. Her voice, a whisper in his memory. It's time. His own hand trembled, the sight of the deer blurring. Grief, sharp and sudden as a winter squall, threatened to overwhelm him. He squeezed his eyes shut, took a ragged breath. He could almost feel Turok's malevolent anticipation. Then, he opened them. The vision of Martha was gone, but a sense of her peaceful presence lingered. The deer was still there, its head now raised, alert, with a newfound stillness in his heart, a sense that some old, tight knot within him had finally begun to loosen. He aimed and fired. The shot was clean. The buck fell. Behind him, Jonas heard a sharp, frustrated hiss. Turok's face was a mask of fury. When they returned to the cabin, the deer dressed and slung over Navo's pony, the atmosphere was subtly changed. The warriors were still there, their expressions unreadable. But the immediate, sharp edge of confrontation had softened, replaced by a heavy, waiting silence. Navo slid from his pony. He did not look at the deer, nor at Jonas immediately. His eyes found Nahili. The man knows the way of the hunt, he said, a simple statement of fact. He then turned to Jonas. You believe a person can choose to whom they belong. Jonas met his gaze. I believe a soul needs peace to thrive. Chief, sometimes, that peace is found in a place or with a person not chosen by blood, but by the heart's own compass. Navo considered this, his gaze distant. For the people, he said slowly, his voice heavy with the weight of his own world. Belonging is the root that grounds the tree. Without it, the strongest storm will prevail. Freedom, for us, is found within the circle of the tribe, not outside it. He looked back at Nahili, his expression a mixture of profound love and unutterable sadness. The path you walk, daughter, is a lonely one. He stood for a long moment, the silence stretching, taut as a bowstring. Turok stepped forward, beginning to speak heatedly in Comanche, gesturing towards Nahili and Jonas, his voice rising in protest. Navo cut him off with a single, sharp word. his authority absolute, silencing the younger warrior instantly, though Turok's eyes still blazed with defiance. Then, Navo finally spoke, his voice softer now, almost a whisper that the wind nearly stole. "The girl," he said, his eyes holding Nahili's, then flicking briefly to Jonas, "no longer belongs to my fire." A visible pain crossed Nahili's face, but Navo continued, his voice thick with emotion. "She has never, not for a moment, left my heart." He turned then, without another word, and mounted his pony. The warriors, including a seething Turok, followed suit. As they began to ride away, Turok twisted in his saddle. His eyes met Jonas's, and with deliberate slowness, he drew a finger across his throat before turning away. A final, unambiguous promise of retribution. They melted into the vast, indifferent landscape, leaving behind an echoing silence and the scent of pine and wood smoke. Jonas and Nahili stood watching until they were mere specks in the distance. The immediate danger had passed, but the shadow of Turok's parting gesture, his earlier threats, lingered in the cold air, a promise of future reckonings, sharper and more defined than any storm the plains could muster. Nahili finally let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for an eternity. She turned to Jonas, her eyes filled with a complex tapestry of gratitude, sorrow, and a new, fragile strength. The choice had been made, the ties of blood acknowledged but redefined. The path ahead was uncertain. But for now, in the quiet solitude of the small cabin, they had each other, and the uneasy peace of a battle weathered, if not entirely won. What did you think of today's story? If it made your day, drop a good in the comments. If it didn't hit the mark, just type 1. Got your own thoughts? I'd love to hear them below. And hey, don't forget to hit subscribe. It's free, and it really helps the channel grow. Thank you so much for being here. The departure of Navo and his warriors left behind an unnerving quiet, a silence that settled over the plains like a fresh fall of snow, muffling the sharp edges of the recent confrontation, but not its lingering echoes. Turok's final, venomous glish was a brand on Jonas's memory, a promise of storms yet to gather. Nahili remained. Jonas had made no plea for her to stay. His cabin was a refuge, not a cage, but in the unspoken language that had grown between them, he knew she would not leave unless it was her own heart's choosing, and her heart, for now, seemed inclined towards the fragile peace they had begun to carve out in this isolated corner of the world. The days that followed unfolded with a slow, quiet rhythm, weaving them closer, not with fiery declarations, but with the sturdy threads of shared existence and silent trust. They fell into a pattern of mutual reliance. Jonas would tend to the heavier ranch work, mending fences Turok's passage might have tested, or scouting for game, while Nahili transformed the stark interior of the cabin. It wasn't that she erased Martha's presence. Rather, she seemed to honor it. One afternoon, Jonas returned from checking his trap lines to find Nahili carefully dusting and rehanging a faded blue curtain Martha had painstakingly embroidered with a delicate tracery of prairie roses. He'd taken it down months ago, the sight of it too poignant a reminder. Seeing it now, handled with such gentle respect by Nahili, a soft light filtering through its worn fabric, Jonas felt a shift within him. He had long considered selling the land, leaving this place that was both sanctuary and sepulcher. But watching Nahili, her dark hair catching the afternoon sun as she adjusted the drape, he saw not a tomb for his past, but the sturdy framework of a home, capable, perhaps, of sheltering a future. They shared meals in comfortable quiet, the crackle of the fire, their main companion. Sometimes, Nahili would sing her soft, haunting Comanche lullabies as she worked a piece of hide or mended a garment. Jonas, in turn, found himself sharing fragments of his life with Martha, small, Everyday memories that no longer felt like reopening a wound, but like sharing a cherished map of a country he had once known. There was no blaze of passion between them, nothing like the youthful fire he'd shared with Martha, but something deeper, perhaps a slow, simmering warmth, a steadfast reliance that grew stronger with each passing day, like the deep roots of an ancient cottonwood. Nahili, he discovered, possessed a keen intellect and a quiet determination. On the far side of the creek, in a dilapidated, long-abandoned line shack, lived a handful of mixed-blood children, mostly Comanche and Kiowa, ostracized by the few distant white settlers and largely forgotten by their own scattered people. Nahili began to visit them. At first, Jonas watched with a wary curiosity. He'd see her sitting with them, her voice a low murmur as she shared stories from her own childhood, or pointed to the shapes of letters she drew in the dirt with a stick. She was teaching them, he realized with a start, not just words, but a sense of their own worth, a connection to a heritage that others sought to erase. He found himself accompanying her sometimes, leaving a share of their hunted game or a sack of flour, his presence a silent statement of support against the unseen, but keenly felt disapproval that emanated from the distant, scattered homesteads. The need for supplies eventually drove them towards the settlement of Redemption. A good half-day's ride. Jonas felt a familiar tightening in his gut as they approached. Redemption was a hardscrabble town, populated by folk who clung to their own narrow definitions of decency with a fierce tenacity. As they rode down the dusty main street, a hush fell. Storekeepers paused in their doorways, their faces hardening. Women pulled their children closer, their whispers like the rustle of dry leaves. Sharp and critical, Jonas felt the weight of their collective gaze, 100 eyes dissecting them. The aging white rancher and the young Comanche woman at his side. It was a story they had already written in their minds, and it was not a kind one. At Henderson's general store, the air was thick with unspoken condemnation. Mr. Henderson, a man Jonas had traded with for years, suddenly found it hard to meet his eye. His transactions clipped, his prices seemingly inflated. As they were leaving, Mayor Thompson, a portly man whose piety was as pronounced as his pocket watch, stepped into their path, flanked by Reverend Miller, whose sermons often touched upon the perils of straying from the righteous path. Jonas, Mayor Thompson began, his tone more an accusation than a greeting. A man of your years. One would expect a certain decorum. The good Lord calls us to live in a way that upholds Christian values, not fraternize in a manner that offends public sensibility. Reverend Miller nodded gravely. The mixing of kinds. It is not what the scriptures envision for a harmonious community. Jonas. It sets a poor example. Nahili stood beside Jonas, her head held high, her expression serene. Though Jonas could feel the tension in her arm where he lightly touched her elbow, he met their accusing stares, his own gaze level. He thought of Nahili teaching those forgotten children, of her quiet courage facing her father, of the gentle way she had rehung Martha's curtain. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, but it cut through the hostile silence of the gathered onlookers like a well-honed blade. For those who concern themselves so deeply with my affairs, he said, his eyes sweeping over the crowd before returning to the mayor and the reverend. Miss Nahili and I will be married in the spring. A collective gasp rippled through the small crowd. Mayor Thompson's jaw dropped. Reverend Miller looked as if Jonas had struck him. No one, however, dared to ask him to repeat himself. Jonas simply nodded, took Nahili's arm more firmly, and led her towards their wagon. The ride back to the cabin was quiet, the unspoken words hanging heavy between them. That night, the weight of the day, the town's judgment, and Jonas's unexpected declaration settled into the small spaces of their shared home. Later, as a pale moon cast long shadows across the floor, Jonas thrashed in his sleep, a nightmare, vivid and terrifying, had him in its grip. He cried out, a strangled sound, and then, clearly, "Martha, Martha, don't go." Nahili was awake instantly. She moved to his side, her touch gentle on his sweat-slicked forehead. "Jonas," she whispered. "Shh, you are dreaming. You are safe." He jolted awake, his eyes wild for a moment, and in the dim, flickering light from the dying embers in the hearth, he looked at her, a deep confusion in his gaze. "Martha," he breathed, his voice raw with remembered pain. The name, spoken with such aching longing, was a shard of ice in Nahili's heart. She said nothing. Her hand faltered, then slowly withdrew, with a quiet grace that tore at Jonas's newly awakened senses. She rose and retreated to her own pallet on the far side of the room, the space between them suddenly a vast, cold chasm. She did not weep, showed no anger, only a profound, sorrowful stillness. The silence that followed was heavier than any judgment the town could offer. Jonas lay there, the echoes of his nightmare mingling with a fresh, acute shame. He had wounded her, deeply, unintentionally. He watched her still form, her back to him, a silhouette of quiet pain against the moonlit window. Finally, he rose. He crossed the small space and knelt beside her pallet. "Nahili," he began, his voice raspy. I am sorry, deeply sorry." She didn't turn, but he sensed her listening. "Martha, she was my life. For so long." He struggled for words, the confession raw and difficult. "Losing her, it hollowed me out. I thought this cabin, these plains, were just a place to wait out my own ending. I never thought." He paused, gathering his courage. "I never thought my heart could feel anything again beyond that old grief." He reached out, hesitantly, and touched her shoulder. "What I said in town today, Nahili, about the spring, I meant it, not as a shield against their gossip, but because—" He took a deep breath. "Because you have brought life back to this place. You've brought life back to me. You've shown me that the heart can make room, that new roots can grow even in soil that seemed barren." He saw her shoulders tremble slightly. Slowly, she turned to face him, her dark eyes luminous in the dim light, glistening with unshed tears. "I understand grief, Jonas," she said, her voice soft but steady. "My people, we know what it is to lose, to have shadows where loved ones once stood. I do not wish to be a shadow to your Martha. You are not a shadow." "Nahili," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You are a light, a different light, a new warmth." He gently cupped her face in his calloused hands. "My heart aches for what I lost with Martha. It always will, in a way, but it is also learning to beat again. For you, if you'll let it." A single tear traced a path down her cheek. She leaned into his touch, a silent surrender, a quiet acceptance. He drew her close, and she came willingly, her head resting against his chest. They held each other for a long time, the silence no longer a chasm, but a sanctuary. The cabin, once a tomb for a love that was, now cradled the tender, burgeoning hope of a love that could be, a love forged in shared solitude, tested by prejudice, and now, finally, given voice in the quiet honesty of the night. The spring, Jonas knew, would bring more than just wildflowers to the plains. Time, like the slow meandering river in the valley below, smoothed the sharp edges of memory and mistrust. Winter relinquished its icy hold, and with the coming of spring, then the full warmth of summer, the plains bloomed with a resilience that seemed to mirror Nahili's own quiet integration into the fabric of this small, once judgmental corner of the world. The townsfolk of redemption, those who had initially cast stones of condemnation with their eyes, began to soften. Perhaps it was Jonas's unwavering, quiet dignity beside her, or Nahili's own serene composure in the face of their suspicion. Or perhaps it was the sight of her, a few times a week, patiently teaching not only the forgotten native children by the creek, but also a couple of the curious, shy white children from outlying homesteads, their small hands learning to weave intricate patterns with colored grasses or trace the shapes of letters in the dust under her gentle tutelage. She was no longer simply the Comanche girl, the stranger. She was Nahili, the woman who had chosen to stay, the woman who brought a quiet skill and a deep well of patience to those who needed it most. Their life at the cabin settled into a rhythm of shared purpose and gentle affection. Jonas, his heart lighter than it had been in years, found a quiet joy in teaching Nahili the finer points of handling his old Winchester. Marveling at her quick eye and steady hand, she, in turn, showed him the subtle art of tracking rabbits not just for sustenance, but with an understanding of their place in the wild tapestry. They mended fences together, the easy silence between them punctuated by the thud of the mallet or the cry of a hawk circling overhead. They cooked their meals over the hearth, the aroma of stewed rabbit or freshly baked bread filling the small space with a sense of simple abundance. Evenings were for stories, his of a life lived and loves lost in a distant east, hers of a childhood under vast, starlit skies. Of traditions and beliefs that painted the world in colors, Jonas was only just beginning to apprehend. Their love was not the raging fire of youth he remembered with Martha, but something more akin to the deep, glowing embers of a hearth fire on a cold night, a constant, unwavering warmth that radiated outwards, or like an underground spring, unseen but persistent, nurturing life from below. It was a love that had taken root slowly, tended by shared sorrows and small, everyday joys. Strong and sure, one crisp autumn afternoon, as the cottonwoods along the creek blazed gold, Nahili, her movements a little slower, her form softened with a new fullness, approached Jonas as he was splitting firewood. She took his calloused hand, her touch surprisingly firm, and placed it gently on her abdomen. Beneath his palm, he felt a faint, fluttering movement, a tiny, insistent pulse of life. Awe, profound and humbling, washed over him. He looked into her dark, luminous eyes and saw there a reflection of his own unspoken joy, his own incredulous hope. That evening, by the light of a flickering lamp, Jonas retrieved the small, unfinished cradle he had started for his and Martha's firstborn, the one lost so long ago. Dust lay thick upon it, a shroud of old grief. With a new purpose beating in his chest, he began to work on it again. Each pass of the plane, each carefully driven peg, was not an act of replacing a lost dream, but of building a new one, a testament to the enduring power of life and the unexpected grace of a second chance. He was crafting a welcome for a child who would be born not into a legacy of sorrow, but into a home filled with a quiet, resilient love. But the plains, like life itself, seldom offered peace without a price. Word reached them, carried on the wind by a passing trapper, then confirmed by a nervous scout from a friendly band. Turok, consumed by a bitter, obsessive rage, had broken from Navo's leadership, with a small, hardened band of young warriors, disenfranchised and loyal to his promise of violent reclamation. He was riding towards redemption, his stated purpose to take back what was his, to reclaim Nahili by force and punish the white man who had, in his eyes, stolen here. The news sent a ripple of fear through the small settlement, but also something else, a hesitant, grudging solidarity. When Turok's riders, perhaps a dozen strong, their faces grim, their ponies lathered, appeared on the ridge overlooking Jonas's cabin a few days later, Jonas did not stand alone. Beside him, near the newly mended corral fence, stood Henderson, the storekeeper, looking uncomfortable but resolute, holding an old squirrel rifle. Two homesteaders from down the valley, whose children Nahili had taught to read, were there as well, armed with shotguns, their expressions grim. Even Mayor Thompson, looking pale but determined, stood slightly behind them, unarmed but present. It wasn't an army, but it was a statement. Nahili was no longer just Jonas's concern. She had become, in some small way, a part of them. Turok, his face a mask of fury and desperation, rode forward, his warriors fanning out behind him. "She comes with me, white man," he snarled, his hand gripping the hilt of his knife. "This ends now. She is of the people. She is mine." Jonas stepped forward, his own rifle held loosely at his side, its barrel pointed towards the earth. He felt a profound calm settle over him, the quiet strength he had found with Nahili. "Turok," he said, his voice steady, carrying in the tense silence. "There has been enough pain, enough loss. Nahili is not a possession to be claimed. She is a woman who has made her choice. A life taken in anger cannot be reclaimed in peace." He spoke not of fighting, but of the futility of it, of the sacredness of choice. "You speak of what is yours. Does a heart belong to anyone but itself?" The air was thick with impending violence. Turok's warriors shifted, their weapons ready. Henderson nervously cocked his rifle. Then, Nahili moved. She walked calmly from the cabin, unarmed, her pregnancy now evident, and stepped into the open space between Jonas and Turok. Her gaze, clear and unwavering, met Turok's fiery stare. "Turok," she said, her voice not loud, but resonant with an undeniable authority. "You say you wish to claim me. He who wishes to claim my spirit must first understand the journey of my heart. You say you wish to keep me. He who wishes to truly hold another must first grant them their wings to fly free." She gestured to her belly. "I carry a new life here, a life born of a new path, a new understanding. This is my life now. It is the only life I will live." Turok stared at her, his chest heaving. He saw her then, truly saw her. Not the girl who had fled his possessiveness, but a woman, strong, rooted in a new world, carrying the child of another man. Her spirit irrevocably changed, soaring beyond his reach. His rage still burned, but beneath it, a bitter, dawning comprehension seemed to flicker. He looked at Jonas, at the quiet resolve in the older man's eyes, at the handful of townsfolk standing awkwardly but defiantly with him. He looked back at Nahili, at the undeniable truth of her words and the new life she represented. Slowly, almost painfully, the tension in his shoulders eased. The fire in his eyes did not die, but it banked, smoldering into a weary acceptance. He had lost, not to Jonas's strength, not to the threat of the townsfolk's guns, but to Nahili's own unyielding spirit, to the undeniable reality that she no longer belonged to the past he so desperately clung to. With a sharp, guttural cry that was more anguish than anger, he spun his pony around. He barked an order to his men, and without a backward glance, they rode away, a wave of bitter disappointment receding into the vast indifference of the plains. The silence they left behind was profound, filled with the scent of dust and the unspoken relief of a storm averted. Jonas moved to Nahili's side, his hand finding hers. The townsfolk slowly lowered their weapons, exchanging uncertain, grateful glances. Some time later, as the sun began to dip towards the western horizon, painting the sky in hues of rose and amber, Jonas and Nahili stood before their cabin. The air was cool, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of another turning season. In the distance, a herd of wild horses, mares and their long-legged foals, galloped freely across the wide, open grasslands, their manes and tails streaming in the wind. An untamed, breathtaking vision of liberty. Nahili held a newly crafted arrow in her hand, its shaft smooth and straight, its fletching made from the pure white feathers of a snow goose. She didn't knock it to a bow, but held it aloft for a moment, a silent salute to the horizon, to the future that stretched before them, vast and unknown, yet embraced with open hearts. Their home, once a place of solitude and sorrow, now stood as a quiet testament to love's enduring power to heal, to connect, and to build anew, even in a land that belonged to no single soul, but was now, undeniably, theirs. Naitanamozim, what would you have done if she showed up at your door, bleeding, barefoot, and hunted? Would you have turned her away, or stood your ground like Jonas did? Tell me down in the comments. I want to know what you think about this kind of love, this kind of risk, and if stories like this stir something in you, tales of the frontier, of quiet heroes and impossible choices, then hit that subscribe button. There's more where this came from.